Well, good morning, everyone, at Winnipeg Evangelical Free Church. I'm sorry I can't be with you there today in person to dialogue with you on this morning's lesson. This morning we're going to be taking from this good book, the Holy Bible. We'll be taking from a number of different textbooks like this one, Ancient Israel's History, and my personal favorite, E.P. Sanders' Judaism, Practice and Belief. Yeah, that was a read. And this is just 100 years from 66 BC to 66 CE. So there they are, today's source texts. I wanted to take a quick minute to thank you all for now attending. This is now the third session and hanging in there on a topic like this, the church and Israel. It is especially helpful to me when you seek me out before and after the session and just give me feedback and encouragement. That's been very helpful. In the first 2 weeks, you have not let me down. I'm learning what to make more of and what to make less of directly from your feedback. Any future recipients of this course will be in your debt. Last week, we began the lesson series of the Church in Israel with an overview of 23 centuries of Jewish anti-Semitism. As most of you might recall, I only got to 20 centuries of Jewish anti-Semitism, but the constraints of this course required me to keep the pace up, so we are going to keep moving. This morning, I've decided to go back in time a little bit and to zoom into a period of history that is a bit hazy for most Christians. The reason that it's hazy is that the Protestant Bible closes with the prophet Malachi at about 450 BC, and then the first book of the New Testament opens with the birth of Christ. So there's about a 400 plus year hole in there. Even more remarkable is that the Jewish community the Jewish community that we find from Ezra and Nehemiah's times are different, quite different, than the Jewish community that we find in the Gospels. It should be noted here that the Catholic and Orthodox Bible do not have the same gap that the Protestant Bible has. Their Bibles include books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees, filling in the gap from about 200 BC to the birth of Christ. So what happened? What occurred during these 400 plus years to bring us to the state that we find ourselves in the New Testament Gospels? Does a knowledge of history, language, culture, idiom help us as we strive to interpret the New Testament texts properly and accurately? I hope the obvious answer here is yes, it does. So this morning we're going to look at the 400-year plus period from a historical and a political point of view. Very little time will be spent this morning on the religious point of view. 2 weeks from now, when we meet again, we will dedicate a morning to the religious developments of this same period, especially Judaism. So we will do it. So where do we start? Well, we start at the end of the Old Testament. The Jews lose their land and are a conquered people from the Assyrians. You might recall the Assyrians from the book of Jonah. These are the people that he was sent to prophesy to. They were evil, nasty people. The city was Nineveh. These people were just awful. And according to VeggieTales, they slap people in the face with fish. These are the people of Assyria. I wish that it was all that they were guilty of. Well, in 722 BC, the Assyrians finally rose up as a world threat and invaded Israel and took away the kingdom of Israel. Well, the Assyrians started, historically, a game of what I would like to call empire leapfrog that saw one empire after another swallow up the old empire, expand it, and then fall apart again as the following empire came and took them. So Babylon was next. In 597 BC, they exiled the rest of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah. It is during this period that the book of Daniel is concerned. One of Daniel's visions explicitly outlined the fall of Babylon and the next two empires to come. His prophecy was so specifically accurate to history that critical scholars are forced to conclude that Daniel was written much later in history, after the fact, and made it look like it was written, just made it look like it was written during the Babylonian exile. That is how excellent Daniel's prophecies were. So Assyria takes Israel Babylon takes Assyria, and in 539, leapfrog again, Persia takes Babylon. Persian religious belief was that the gods of the world were ethnic. This is a bit different. They believed that the gods belonged to an actual territory, and the people shared the ethnicity of the god. And so, if you were to take the treasure and the idols and the relics and the people and contain them within the geographical territory of another ethnic god's land, you would actually be offending both of these gods. You know, fighting humans was hard enough. Fighting gods was doomed to failure. After all, that's why Babylon fell, isn't it? So a small number of Jews did return to their homeland under the leadership of Ezra and Nehemiah. This made sense. Persia wanted them out of their ethnic zone and into the ethnic zone of Yahweh where they belonged. Ezra had won a number of important concessions from Artaxerxes, including the return of the gold and silver taken from the temple, permission to draw on the royal treasury of a neighboring province if they needed any money, exemption of temple personnel from Persian taxes, and the right to appoint civil magistrates in the land of Judah, and to enforce the Torah with the power of life and death over the guilty. Significantly, the scripture writers take extra effort to ensure that we understand that the leader of Israel, Zerubbabel, was in fact a descendant of David, and that the high priest appointed at the time was in fact a descendant of Zadok, and thus connecting him to Aaron. The temple was completed in 515 BCE during the reign of Darius. It was a small, meager temple, and the people were kind of about it. Haggai warned that the people were not to that the people were not to treat this small accomplishment with contempt. For the day would come that God would fill this humble structure with the glory of his climactic triumph. You'll find that in the book of Haggai, chapter 2. So here we are now, at the end of the Old Testament. So far, I haven't presented anything to you that you haven't heard before. So let's get to the new stuff. Before I jump into the rise of the next empire after the Persians, I do need to go down 3 rabbit holes first. Rabbit hole number 1, the Elephantine Jews. In 1907 and 1908, archaeologists uncovered Aramaic papyri, mostly of business contracts, property titles, legal documents, and the like. 2 documents were found in these excavations that help explain the Jewish religious life in Egypt in the 5th century. This community of Jews originated from the original Assyrian exile from the northern kingdom, which we spoke about earlier in the Bible. Since the Jews made such excellent soldiers and warriors, the Assyrians decided to take a full detachment of them and their families on the conquest of Egypt. In them, it was discovered that the Jews had built a temple for themselves in these papyri in Elephantine, but that this temple had just been burnt down and needed to be rebuilt. The temple was sacked and it was destroyed by the Egyptian priests local of the god Khnum. And it was because the Jews offered sacrifices of rams. The ram, as it so happened, was the symbolic animal for, you guessed it, Khnum. So the priests of Khnum did not take kindly to this, and they burned down the Jewish temple. The letter was a plea from Elephantine Jews to the Persian government in Judea, Jerusalem, and also to Samaria, and either one that would listen. So there were 2 letters built. The raised temple that these Jews wished to have restored was one that worshipped Yahu, which is a derivative of the name Yahweh, even though Mosaic law forbade any more than a single temple at a place of God's choosing. There's also clear signs of syncretism. Now, syncretism is the amalgamation of different religions, cultures, schools of thought. Think of a kind of a melting pot where you cease to be your own. They worshipped Ishum Bethel, Harem-Bethel, Anath-Bethel, and most amazingly of all, Anat-Yahu. Anat was the Canaanite goddess of fertility and war, sister and consort of Baal. At Elephantine, she appears to have been regarded as the consort of even Yahweh. Here's the papyrus translated and read in part. Now your servants, Yedaniah and his colleagues and the Jews, the citizens of Elephantine, all say thus: If it please our Lord, take thought of this temple to rebuild it, since they do not let us rebuild it. Look to your well-wishers and friends here in Egypt. Let a letter be sent from you to them concerning the temple of the god Yahu, to build it in the fortress of Elephantine as it was built before, and the meal offering, incense, and burnt offerings will be offered in your name, and we shall pray for you at all times, we and our wives and our children. In a socio-cultural environment where gods are believed to be ethnic and territorial, it is understandable why the Jews would pay their respects to the god of Egypt. Elephantine exhibits what can happen to a community of God that allows religious syncretism to creep in and reshape its foundational concepts. The pantheon of deities found here confirm the worst fears of the Hebrew prophets. So rabbit hole number 1 gives us insight to a Jewish settlement in Egypt that was brazen enough to build a temple and had assimilated many pagan practices into Yahweh worship. Rabbit hole number 2, the Samaritan Jews. You may recall in the 12th chapter in the first book of Kings, when Jeroboam divided the kingdom, took 10 tribes with him, and ruled Israel, the northern kingdom. The very first order of business for Jeroboam was to create 2 golden calves and replace temple worship of Jerusalem to these calves. As mentioned earlier, the northern kingdom was the first to be conquered by the Assyrians. They deported any Jews that were worth anything, and they left behind the poor and the sick. Shortly thereafter, the Assyrians colonized the area with their own people. Intermarrying began. This was the creation of the Samaritan Jews. They were half-bloods that worshipped on their own mountain with their own version of the Torah. They rejected the books of the prophets and the wisdom writings in the Hebrew Bible. Only the Torah of Moses was their Bible, and it was a distorted translation at that. During the 2nd century BC, the Samaritans constructed their own temple to rival the temple in Jerusalem. By the time Jesus hits the scene 200 years later, things had hardened so much that when the Samaritan woman sees Jesus in John chapter 4, she just simply states, Jews do not associate with Samaritans. We don't do this. For the Samaritans, the burning religious question of the day was this: should we worship on Mount Gerizim or in Jerusalem? They expected the Messiah to come and to settle this dispute in their favor. So at the bottom of rabbit hole number 2, we have another temple being built, offering sacrifices to Yahweh. So now there's 3 temples: Egypt, Samaria, and Jerusalem. These 3 temples have their respective interpretations of Torah and would lead to many different divisions among the Jews themselves over time. Rabbit hole number 3, the synagogue. The word synagogue in Greek is Greek in origin, and it means a gathering of people. Oddly enough, so does ecclesia, the word we use for church. The Hebrew word is knesset, which is the same word used today for the parliament of modern Israel. With so many Jews in the diaspora, it became necessary for places to be established where the law of Moses could be read and taught. The synagogue became places of worship and prayer for the Jews, but uniquely there was no sacrifices. That was to be done only at the temple. There was no uniform pattern as to which of the 3 temple traditions the specific synagogue would model itself after. They were all over the map. In large towns, a body of 23 elders formed a small s Sanhedrin to govern the synagogue community and the building locally. In smaller towns, 7 elders was permissible to do the same. The Great Sanhedrin in Jerusalem attained eminence as the highest Jewish judiciary, taking up civil as well as religious matters. They had the power to punish by scourging 40 lashes minus 1, excommunication, and they could even arrange for death at the permission of the Roman procurator. Worship in the synagogue was simple. Reading of the Torah, teaching of the Torah, prayer. That's it. Any Israelite could officiate. Didn't need to be a Levite. And there's plenty of evidence that supports that it didn't even need to be a male, as we have plenty of evidence that women were officiants in many synagogues. The segregation of women in Jewish worship was a later development in history under the influence of the rabbis. All right. Now, with those three rabbit holes explored, let's get back to our timeline. Persia never really dominated the area of Greece. The Greeks were not organized in a nation or an empire. They were a collection of city-states with regional rulers. As a result, they never really could mount an army large enough to do any damage. The legendary Spartans were virtually impenetrable for centuries, but only in defensive warfare. The Greeks' preferred method of conquest was through assimilation and through colonization. They'd simply found colonies on foreign soil, begin to conduct trade, and begin to spread their philosophy and their culture. Why subjugate people when you can just simply enlighten them and excite them to the point that they want you as their ruler? Much less blood, much more civilized, far less likely to rebel. Meanwhile, Persia began to rot from the inside, and it's mostly family intrigue that can be blamed. Artaxerxes II survived an assassination attempt by his own brother, Cyrus. Due to the intervention of their shared mother, Cyrus's life was spared. Shortly thereafter, Cyrus tried again, mounted an army in civil war, failed again, this time dying in battle. With this internal affair going on, Persia could not plan a focused assault on Greece as much as they would have liked to. So, to hold Greece off and to distract them, they paid large sums of money to Athens to declare war against their own, Sparta. The hope was that if the Greeks were fighting among themselves, they would not be able to organize and take advantage of Persia's weakness. Persia had more problems than just the Greeks. Many of their conquered states now were revolting against Persia. Egypt was, Cyprus, Phoenicia, Syria followed suit. Many in these regions were actually colonized Greeks who immigrated to these lands in order to spread their culture and their wealth. Disintegration of the Persian Empire continued. There was a brief interlude where Artaxerxes III took reign with force and ferocity. He began his reign by murdering all of his own brothers and sisters, several dozen. He retaliated against the revolting provinces and reconquered Egypt. It looked as though he was going to prepare for an invasion to Greece. One of the Greek city-states, Macedonia, was falling under the leadership of a man named Philip of Macedon, and his young son, Alexander. Philip feared that the city-state structure of the Greeks would make them an easy target for Persia, and he was probably right. He decided to attempt to unify the Greek city-states under one banner. He was successful in uniting the Greeks, all except for Sparta, and he raised up an army, preparing for a preemptive strike against the crumbling empire of Persia. In 336, ready to go, Philip of Macedon was murdered, and Alexander, 20 years old, took his place. While he was Macedonian by nationality, Alexander culturally was Greek, and he was educated by none other than Aristotle himself. By now, Greek had wandered the coastlines of the Mediterranean for a few centuries and had influenced all of their respective settlements, Hellenizing everywhere that they went. What does this word Hellenization mean? Well, the word Hellas, H-E-L-L-A-S, is the original ancient Greek word for Greece. So the process of Hellenization is simply the spreading of Greek thought, religion, culture, art, and government to non-Greek people. From the Greek point of view, Hellenization was the process of turning barbarians into a civilized people. The majority of the subjugated nations within the Persian Empire, especially surrounding the Mediterranean, had grown resentful of Persia, but they were fascinated with Greece. This would provide an excellent base for Alexander's great moment in the sun. Few realize this, but Alexander's conquest required very few military conquests. The Persians fought him 3 different times. Once at Troy, 334, once at Issus, 333, And then, after a 2-year shoring up of the Mediterranean coastlines, including his march into Egypt, where he was welcomed with no resistance, open hands, and declared pharaoh, he advanced finally eastward to Gaugamela in 331 for the final conflict with the Persians. As he went from city to city, he was more often greeted as a liberator than as a conqueror. Ironically, not from battle or political intrigue did Alexander meet his doom. As he was planning a voyage around Arabia in 323 BC, he died from a fever at 33 years of age. It was a fever that stopped Alexander the Great. Well, what happens next? The impact of Greek culture by the time of Alexander had died was irreversible. The rise of the Hellenistic gymnasium, stadium, theater, odium, lyceum, agora were seen not only in Greek colonies, but in all other cities around the Mediterranean coastline. All those who were conquered by the Greeks actually found their lives getting better. They loved the Greeks. Sculptors, poets, musicians, playwrights, philosophers, debaters were all regular partakers on the landscape. Given that Alexander died suddenly at a young age, his succession had not been arranged. After 7 years of struggle, 4 of his generals emerged victorious to claim the empire. In 315 BC, Antigonus, who ruled from the Mediterranean to Asia, Cassander, ruler of Macedonia, Ptolemy took Egypt, and Lysimachus took Thrace. Antigonus had visions of reuniting the entire empire, and he was the strongest of the 4 generals, but he wasn't stronger than the other 4 generals combined. They wished to split the empire and keep their respective territories. In 315 BC, Cassander, Ptolemy, and Lysimachus allied against Antigonus right away and forced him to fracture his empire into 2. Ptolemy promptly promoted Seleucid, one of his generals, and gave half of Antigonus's territory to Seleucus, the Asian portion. This included Syria, the territory of ancient Israel. Before Seleucus could arrive back home in Syria, Ptolemy annexed Syria, actually, and Seleucus made no serious effort to wrestle back his rightfully won territory. There was a sort of polite respect between Seleucid and Ptolemy, as Ptolemy was his mentor. This, however, was not the case between their respective successors. Beginning with the very next generation, Ptolemy II and Antiochus I kicked off the first of 6 wars between these 2 empires. These would take over 100 years to see through. During the century that these 2 mighty Greek empires were fighting each other, a different power in the West began to form and solidify itself. This power was Rome. History records 6 wars between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, between Egypt and Asia. First war of 274 to 271 BC, the Ptolemies were victorious, and so Israel remained in the control of the Ptolemies. The second war was 260 to 253 BC. Again, the Ptolemies were victorious. There's an interlude here that I need to touch base on, and this is the Septuagint. In about 250 BC, at the inspiration of Ptolemy II, the library in Alexandria for Egypt was to obtain a copy of the Hebrew Scriptures in Greek. As legend would have it, the high priest in Jerusalem, Eleazar, assigned this project to 6 elders from each of the 12 tribes. These 72 elders were sent to Alexandria, where in isolation from each other, in a 72-day period, they each took a run at translating the Hebrew text into Greek. And miraculously, all 72 versions were identical in their translation. This translation is remembered as the Bible of the 70, or the Septuagint, and is the translation most quoted by the writers of the New Testament, including Jesus himself. Now, back to the war. Third war, 246 to 241 BC, again, the Ptolemies were victorious. Fourth war, 219 to 217 BC, Ptolemies. Once again, victorious, Israel stays in the hands of the Ptolemies. It was finally the Fifth War that the Seleucids in 202 to 195 BC were victorious, and they now reclaimed Israel's land of Syria into their hands. They intended to go further into Egypt, but Rome intervened, eager to maintain their good supplies for grain. They really relied on the Egypt continent to feed their people in Rome. The Sixth War in 170 to 168 BC was actually picked by the Ptolemies in the first place. Not really sure why. Seleucids repelled successfully and began to set siege to Alexandria as punishment for this war. Egypt, eager not to be conquered, wrote a letter to their friends in Rome, begging for their assistance again. Rome was dependent on Egypt to feed its people, so Rome sent Papilius Linus with orders from the Roman Senate, demanding that the Seleucids withdraw from Egypt. The scene recorded in history is stunning. Imagine this. After crossing the river at Ulysses, about 4 miles from Alexandria, Antiochus IV was met by the Roman commissioners, to whom he had given a friendly greeting and held out his hands. Antiochus with his army, and Papilius limping and in need of a cane with just his aides. The scene reminds me of the Narnia movie Prince Caspian, when we see this massive villainous army on one side of a bridge about to cross, and as they mount the bridge, they see coming on the other side little Lucy Pevensey with nothing but a dagger in her hand. The villainous army is frozen in terror, not because of Lucy, but because walking beside Lucy is the great lion, Aslan. Lucy represented the power of Aslan. Likewise, behind Papilius was the power of Rome. He required no army to strike fear into Antiochus. Papilius placed in Antiochus's hands, his open hands, the tablets on which was written the decree of the Senate, and he told him, read it. After reading it through, Antiochus said that he would call his friends into council and that he would need to consider what was said on the tablets before deciding what to do. Papilius, stern and imperious as ever, drew a circle around the king and with his cane that he was carrying, drew the circle and said, before you step out of this circle, you're going to give me your reply, and I will bring it to the Senate. For a few moments he hesitated, astounded at such a peremptory order, and at last replied, I will do what the Senate thinks is right. Not till then did Papilius extend his hand to the king as a friend and as an ally. Antiochus left Egypt. I described that scene in detail as it captures the obvious strength and world-renowned power the Romans were establishing for themselves. Emissaries of Rome were enough to quell an army. You dare not touch a citizen of Rome. So what was happening in Judea while all this fighting was going on between these rival empires? Well, for that, let's move in between the Third and the Fourth Wars. Remember, the Ptolemies won the first 4 wars. High priests governed Jewish affairs at the pleasure of the ruling empire. Taxes, civil order, and military assistance were expected in return. Onias II took office as the high priest in Judea in 240 BC, and when he held office, he refused to pay the taxes and the tribute to the Ptolemy Empire. Worried of the reprisal of the Ptolemies, his own nephew, Joseph, who was son of Tobias and member of the wealthiest and most influential family in Judea, came to see his uncle and persuaded him to relent. Onias did in fact concede and pay the tax. The Ptolemy Empire recognized that in fact it was Joseph that really got the deed done, and as a consequence decided to split the ruling powers of Judea away from the high priest. And they placed Joseph into a newly formed role as prostasia. Joseph needed some muscle to implement this administration, so upon the promise to double the taxes paid to Egypt, Egypt agreed and dispatched 2,000 soldiers under Joseph's command. Joseph held the office of prostasia from 240 to 218 BC, making the Tobiad family the effective ruling family of Judea. The high priest, of course, continued to function, but only in religious matters. Upon the arrival of the Seleucids in 202 BC, the Jews enjoyed a relaxed rule under Antiochus III. He recognized the Torah as the national law and gave the people internal autonomy. The entire population of Jerusalem was exempted from taxes for 3 years, and then given a 33% tax cut thereafter. I mean, how great would that be, to elect a government and have no taxes for 3 years? That'd be a great platform. All temple personnel were granted complete exemption from taxes, and generous aid was given for rebuilding Jerusalem and the temple. Naturally, there were still pro-Ptolemaic factions in the country, but the majority loved their new ruler. Antiochus IV, however, would not be so loved. For Antiochus, the process of Hellenization was taking too long in Judea. Their Torah, their autonomy, their self-government, their high priest all proved effective resistance against the ideas, philosophies, and progress of the Hellenistic culture. In most conquered states, Greek ideas and culture were welcomed and assimilated. Judea remained remarkably and stubbornly unchanged. Antiochus needed to change this, and in a hurry, so he started with the high priest. Onias III was the high priest of Jerusalem at the time, Orthodox, conservative, Jew of Levitical descent, rightful high priest. His brother Jason, however, was not as rigid and not as conservative, and did show some moderate interest in a few of the benefits that the Greek culture and commerce could bring. So on the promise of a higher tribute to Antiochus IV, he was appointed the new high priest and proceeded to build one of those buildings, the gymnasium, that he thought would be good for the Jews to have, notorious for men exercising in the nude. This caused a great reaction from the conservative Jews, who collected and called themselves the Hasidim, the pious ones. They began to form a resistance movement in an attempt to defend Orthodox Jewish institutions. As Antiochus watched from afar these divisions in Judea, he decided that a more forceful push of Hellenism was required to civilize these barbarian people. So a Jewish high priest that was sympathetic to Hellenism wasn't going to be good enough. We needed a Jewish high priest that was a thorough, sold-out Hellenist. Antiochus found his man. Menelaus, a very close friend of Jason, the current high priest, was a thoroughgoing Hellenist, and he offered Antiochus even more tribute and tax if he could become the high priest. Antiochus loved the idea. Menelaus was a man from the tribe of Benjamin, and this enraged the Hasidim. The high priest had to be a Levite. Jason, the deposed high priest, would not go down quietly. He did raise an army from across the Transjordan and marched on to Jerusalem to challenge Menelaus for the priesthood, and Antiochus now had just simply had enough. So he sent his army into Jerusalem on the Sabbath, a day when he knew the Orthodox Jews would not resist. He slaughtered a large number of Jason's army, destroyed the city walls, built a new fortress housing a garrison. Orders came from Antiochus that the Greek deities were to be worshipped at all time. An Athenian philosopher was dispatched and was sent to Jerusalem to supervise the complete reprogramming of the people. He erected a statue of Jupiter and declared it the God of Israel and placed it on the temple altar. Worst of all, he brought swine into the temple, pigs, and he slaughtered them on the altar of the temple. Under penalty of death, the Jews were forbidden to practice circumcision, Sabbath observance, and any of their other feast days. The Jewish worship of Yahweh was to be eliminated once and for all. This leads me to a period in the history now known as the Maccabean Revolt. So before I get into that, just take a quick look at the person to your left and the person to your right and give them an elbow to just kind of jostle them up, because this is when it starts to get exciting. So wake up, everybody. We're going to get going now on the Maccabean Revolt. The time period I will be talking about here is 167 to 134 BC. In the most unlikely place, an obscure village of Modin, just northwest of Jerusalem, the battle against the Hellenizing tendencies of the Seleucids began. Antiochus' emissaries demanded that a pagan installation be set up in Modin to show respect for the Seleucid government. The citizens of that village were then expected to present themselves before this pagan altar with a sacrifice. To ensure that the rest of the populace would comply, it was ordered that the first person to do this would be the eldest priest of the town. This old man, Mattathias Maccabee, refused. Upon threats from the emissary of utter annihilation of the village, if he were not to comply, another priest stepped forward and offered to do what Mattathias refused to do. Well, this just enraged Mattathias. He drew his sword and he slew both the apostate priest and the emissary of Antiochus. Mattathias, joined by his 5 sons, destroyed the heathen installation and then ran for their lives to the hills, awaiting the reprisal from Antiochus. There on the eastern slopes of the hill country of Judea, others quickly joined this renegade camp, and they continued to raid and destroy pagan altars and symbols of the Hellenistic culture. Guerrilla warfare broke out as the Maccabees-led insurrectionists continued to attack royal officers and even fellow Jews that had been Hellenized. Mattathias was killed early in the revolt, just into the first year. His 3rd son, Judas, took up the leadership of the revolt and would go down in history as Judas the Hammer. Judas won victories in Modin, Beth Horon, Emmaus, and then carried his attack to Jerusalem. Menelaus, the high priest, and his cohorts fled as the Maccabees entered the city. Judas entered the temple, purified it of all that was pagan. The victory would be celebrated to this very day as the Feast of Lights, or as you might know it, Hanukkah. The Seleucids responded and began to siege Jerusalem to retake her. Thankfully, threat of another war in the north forced the Seleucids to abandon their efforts in Jerusalem to go and fend off the more serious threat coming from the north. To arrange this, they needed to offer terms of peace to the Jews. And the terms were, and here were the ones in favor for the Jews: 1, that Syria would not interfere with the internal affairs of Judea. 2, that the law prohibiting Jewish observances would be rescinded. 3, Menelaus would be removed as the high priest. 4, no punishment for the military actions would fall on the Maccabees. That was what the Jews got out of it. What the Syrians got out of it, or the Seleucids, was that they got to name the next high priest. Alchemist would replace Menelaus as high priest. These terms were considered by a provisional council, which included Maccabean army officers, scribes, elders connected with the Hasidim, the Orthodox party that had supported Judas. The Maccabees were not happy with these terms, but in the end they accepted, as they only represented a minority on the council. Alchemist proved to be a friend to Syria shortly thereafter, when he rounded up a number of the Hasidim and had put them to death. Judas' band was now severely depleted. Judas died in a battle against the Syrians, and the remainder of the Maccabean army fled across the Jordan, now under the leadership of the youngest brother, Jonathan. Syria persisted in trying to wipe out this patriot band of rebels, but they were not able to. Civil war broke out in Syria, and a contest for the Seleucid throne was underway. Jonathan agreed to assist in the civil war with the king that he thought would give him back control of Jerusalem. This would prove to be Alexander Ballas, an impostor with no royal blood, but who did manage to win the throne with the help of the Maccabees. Alexander's rule was only 5 years, and when he was overthrown by Demetrius II, royal blood to be sure, Jonathan died during this time, so Simon Maccabee took over. Having sided with Demetrius II, the Jews were granted full immunity from taxes. The leaders in Israel named Simon leader and high priest forever, until there should arise a faithful prophet. So in doing this, the Hasidic party justified this action by pointing out that the family of Ananias had gone to Egypt, and as a result, as rightful heirs to the high priest throne, had rescinded their opportunities. An amazing decision coming from the representatives of the pure Orthodox party of the Jews. It should be noted, however, that the Maccabees were legitimate descendants of the tribe of Levi, so they were still Levitical. These same Hasidics would eventually form the party that you know as the Pharisees. This now takes us to our next period of time, which is the Hasmonean dynasty. The Hasmonean kings were really descendants of Simon Maccabee, but historians assign different names to them for ease of discussion. The Maccabee period is really about a father and his 5 sons struggling for the independence of Israel, while the Hasmonean period represents a line of kings in the same bloodline. Simon Maccabee, the first Hasmonean leader, distinctly not the title of king, by the way, only a descendant of David, remember, could make that claim, successfully defended and expanded the kingdom of Israel. His reign ended in a treacherous ordeal, however. Simon had given his daughter in marriage to Ptolemy, the governor of Jericho, for political reasons. Now, this Ptolemy is not to be confused with the Ptolemaic Empire in Egypt. There is no relation except their name. He was a Seleucid, to be sure. Ptolemy invited Simon and his 3 sons to a banquet in Jericho. Only Simon and 2 sons could make the banquet. Ptolemy pounced on Simon and the 2 sons, killing them, all 3 of them, and then aggressively pursued John, the remaining son, and failed to kill him. Ptolemy held John's mother hostage in order to force John's surrender of him. John did not surrender, and he assumed the throne of his father in 134 BC. John took on the ruling name of John Hyrcanus I. Ptolemy carried out his threat, and he did kill John's mother and captured relatives. Despite the Maccabean effort to rid Judea of all Hellenistic influence, they were not successful. Far too popular were the ideas and the ideals of Hellenism, and it continued to spread like a zombie apocalypse. Various groups continued to polarize because of Hellenism and related topics. The Hasidim, the pious, were the most conservative Jews. They insisted that religious liberty, strict adherence to the law, and rejection of all forms of Hellenism. The Hasidim were vindicated through the Maccabean struggle, although the Maccabees and the Hasidim were not totally aligned on everything. As mentioned earlier, the Hasidim would become the Pharisee party. The Hellenistic party, on the other hand, was best represented by the party that has since become known as the Sadducees. They recognized the written Torah only, explicitly the first 5 books of Moses, but they did not want it applied to all the circumstances of their times for fear that it would limit their ability to move freely in this Hellenistic society. Both the Pharisees and the Sadducees are named historically for the first time during the reign of Hyrcanus. Hyrcanus continued with military campaigns to expand Israel, but is always sensitive to stay on the good side of the Romans. Significantly, Hyrcanus destroyed the Samaritan sanctuary on Mount Gerizim, taking the city of Samaria in the process. John Hyrcanus maintained his Hasidic background and approach to faith during his reign, but the same cannot be said of his children. They had grown up as aristocrats in a palace. Their training was more Greek than Hebrew, and they shared a great disdain for the Pharisees. In preparation of his death, Hyrcanus arranged for his eldest son, Aristobulus, to assume the high priesthood, and for his wife to rule the political affairs. Upon Hyrcanus' death in 104 BC, Aristobulus usurped the throne with the help of his brother Antigonus. He threw his mother and remaining brothers in prison without food, leaving them to starve to death. All did, but one brother. He declared himself not only ruler of Israel, but as its king. This was new. The Sadducees and the Essenes weren't concerned with this title, but the Pharisees were infuriated. They felt that only a descendant of David could take this throne. They began a massive rebellion with the people to depose the king. Josephus named Aristobulus a friend of the Greeks. However, alcohol, disease, and continual fear of insurrection and rebellion brought an early death to him after only 1 year of reign. This 1 year was long enough for his wife, Alexandra Salome, to implant paranoia in his mind about his brother Antigonus wanting the throne. So Aristobulus, before he died, also had his brother killed. This left one brother left in prison who had survived starvation. Upon the death of Aristobulus, Queen Alexandra Salome had the only remaining brother in prison released. She married him and declared him king. Smart woman. His name was Alexander Janus, a Greek name which should inform all of you where his allegiances really lay. Janus continued to expand the borders of Israel and succeeded in expanding them to the traditional borders of David and Solomon. Alexander Jannaeus alienated almost all of the non-Hellenized Jews in the Jewish population. At one memorable feast, when he was acting as high priest, in contempt for the Pharisees, he poured out a water libation on his own feet instead of the altar as prescribed. Outraged by this act of sacrilege, the people in the temple pelted Jannaeus with lemons, which they were carrying in honor of the feast. The soldiers were called in, and many lives were lost. Civil war broke out as a result. The Pharisees had already been assembling a rebellion and ironically sought help from the Syrians to defend them against the descendants of the Maccabees. The Syrians came, and Jannaeus was forced to retreat to the Judean hills. With time to reflect on what they had done, however, the Pharisees feared that the Syrians would reclaim Judea. Thus, thousands of Pharisees deserted the Syrian army and went back to Jannaeus in order to drive the Syrians back out of Judea again. Jannaeus did not forget the Pharisees' original rebellion, despite their return to his army. Jannaeus hunted down the leaders of the rebellion, and at a banquet that he held for the leaders of the Sadducees in honor of the victory, he had 800 Pharisees crucified in the presence of his celebrating guests. Jannaeus died in 76 BC during a military conflict. Once again, Salome Alexandra was to succeed the throne, and this time she did. Salome Alexandra was ready to rule. She had already been a major influence behind the reigns of both Aristobulus and Jannaeus. At once, she sought to settle the conflict with the Pharisees. Her own brother, Simeon ben Shattah, was one of the leaders of the Pharisees, a fact that greatly assisted in the settling and the bringing of peace between the throne and the Pharisees. Her new policies favored the Pharisees rather than the Sadducees. Under the presidency of Simeon ben Shattah, the Sanhedrin decreed that every young man, for example, should be educated, with primary emphasis being placed on the training in Hebrew scriptures. Thus, comprehensive systems of education, schooling, was installed in most of the larger villages, towns, and cities in Judea. This was singularly unique in the ancient world and made the people of Judea the most educated people in the ancient world. Amazing public education at the hand of the Pharisees. The elite always had education and access to it in every nation across all time, but not the commoners. This is one of the ways in which the Pharisees were bringing the faith to the people. More on that next week. The reign of Alexandria was rather peaceful. There are still some scores being settled between Pharisees and Sadducees. The wounds were deep, but ultimately it was a peaceful 9-year reign. As Alexandra was a woman, she could not fill the joint role of ruler and high priest, so she saw it fit to appoint her eldest son, Hyrcanus II, to the office of high priest, while she appointed to his brother, Aristobulus II, the military commander of the army. Knowing that both would make claim for the throne in her absence, she kept them at bay and apart from one another to prevent open conflict. Upon her death in 67 BC, after 9 years of reign, Hyrcanus II was named king at both her request and by right of being the eldest brother. Aristobulus would not let matters stand, and with the help of the disenfranchised Sadducees, he laid siege to Jerusalem. Hyrcanus could not appeal to the Pharisees for help, for they had neither the means, ability, or desire to carry out a war. Hyrcanus was forced to renounce his throne, surrendered to Aristobulus. Hyrcanus II fled to the region of Idumea, and in exchange for the guarantee of transferring territory of Moab over to the Nabateans, they agreed to stand with him to retake his throne. The Nabateans were an Arabian army. Simultaneously, both Hyrcanus and Aristobulus sent letters to the local representative of the Roman Empire seeking arbitration in this dispute. His name was Legate Aemilius Scaurus, and Scaurus selected Aristobulus purely because the Hyrcanus family had relations with the Nabateans, which were enemies of Rome. Hyrcanus was not satisfied with this result and appealed directly to Pompey of Rome himself in person. Aristobulus heard of this and also made a plea in person to carry on as king of Israel. Pompey refused to decide the matter, but did say that he was coming to Judea in the following year and would decide it in person then. And come he did, with an army. Aristobulus did not wait for Pompey's decision. He fled to his fortress in Alexandrion and prepared for battle with Pompey. Pompey did not originally intend to come to Judea in force, but was incited to by the aggressive actions of Aristobulus. Pompey quickly dealt with Aristobulus, entered into Jerusalem, walked straight into the temple, and the people of Jerusalem feared the worst, that it would be another desecration of the temple, but Pompey destroyed nothing. Sacrifices continued the very next day, with Hyrcanus II declared as the high priest. Accordingly, in 63 BC, Roman rule came to Jerusalem, and Judea became subject to Roman tribute. Hyrcanus II continued to play a limited role as the high priest in Jerusalem. The Hasmonean rule had now come to an end. We are nearing the end of this morning's lesson, but I would be remiss if I did not touch on the initial days of the rule of Rome in Judea. There are a couple of important characters that inform the biblical narrative. To do so, I need to introduce a character from the region that borders Judea directly to the south of it, a territory called Idumea. For most of the Old Testament period in the Bible, the region that went under the name of Idumea was actually called Edom. There were plenty of mixed marriages between Israel and Idumea, and as a result, most Idumeans had authentic Jewish ancestry. The leader of Idumea was an important figure called Antipater. He helped to keep Hyrcanus II alive and meddled in Judean affairs all of his life. When Jerusalem fell to Rome under Pompey, Hyrcanus was named the high priest and responsible for both the administration of Judea and tax collection on behalf of the Roman Empire. Hyrcanus proved to be ineffective at both, as far as Rome was concerned. Antipater, a friend of Rome with Jewish blood, offered to assist Rome in this regard. Pompey placed Antipater in charge of Judea regarding administration and tax collection. Hyrcanus still remained the high priest. Antipater had a special gift. His special talent was that he was able to anticipate the winning side of two separate Roman civil wars. First, he sided with Julius Caesar against Pompey. Antipater was rewarded by Caesar by being declared the first Roman procurator of Judea. Antipater promptly split the region into two and assigned two of his sons as governors. Faisal became the governor of Jerusalem, the south, and Herod became the governor of Galilee. There's a name that should be ringing a bell. Upon the assassination of Caesar in 44 BC, civil war broke out again, and once again, Antipater and his sons picked the winning side, Cassius and Antony. In 40 BC, the Parthian Empire waged war with Rome and conquered the Judean territory. Faisal died in this conflict, and Herod fled. Herod went to Rome and sought assistance in retaking Judea. The Roman Senate named Herod King of the Jews before he even mounted a horse to take back Judea. First, Herod took back Galilee in 37 BC, and he made his way to Jerusalem to lay siege to the city. Prior to the attack of Jerusalem, however, he cunningly married Miriam, a princess of the beloved Hasmonean Empire or dynasty. This gave Herod support among many Jews that were still loyal to the Hasmonean family. Herod succeeded in driving the Parthians out of Judea. Herod combined extraordinary vigor, personal bravery, tactical skill, ruthlessness, and administrative gifts. He was up to the task of being the king of the Jews, and the Romans were happy to leave him to it, having at last found a reliable client king who could hold down the most unruly part of the empire, the Jews. Herod always feared the strength of the Hasmoneans. Initially, he attempted to appease them by marrying Miriam and appointing her brother Aristobulus III the high priest. Aristobulus' popularity as high priest grew rapidly, too rapidly for Herod's taste, so he had him drowned. He also suspected his wife Miriam in a plot against him, so he had her killed. Eager to maintain popular support from the Jews and surrounding nations, Herod became a great builder, and that's what he's known as in history. It was during his reign that the temple in Jerusalem was built on a scale never before seen. As Herod aged, his fears for his own security became even more pronounced. His suspicions reached even to his own blood sons. Herod had 3 more sons killed, leaving 3 to survive him. In 4 BC, Herod the Great died. Augustus, the emperor of the Roman Empire, determined that none of the Herod's sons were up to the task of ruling the entire region as Herod was, decided to break the region into 3, and he parceled it out to Herod's sons. Archelaus received the largest share, Judea, Samaria, and Idumea. Antipas received Galilee and Perea, east of the Jordan. And Philip, several territories north and east of the Sea of Galilee. Both Philip and Antipas were given the title Tetrarch. Archelaus' career was not successful. Delegations of both Jews and Samaritans accused him of brutality and maladministrations. Emperor Augustine banished him in 6 CE. His territory fell under direct administration of Rome by the official called a prefect. The infamous biblical character Pontius Pilate, became prefect in 26 CE. The prefects governed his territories until 41 CE. Antipas fared much better than Archelaus. He lasted 43 years until his second wife, Herodias, persuaded him to seek the title of king. The result of this request was that he was deposed and exiled. His territory was given to one of Herod's grandsons, Agrippa I. Agrippa was eventually entrusted with Judea as well, but he died after a short 3-year reign. Thus, Judea, Samaria, and Galilee fell again under direct Roman administration, once more by the procurators. So at this point, I would like to bring this brief summary of intertestamental history to a close. We have arrived at the world that is familiar to us from the New Testament. Next weekend, Thanksgiving weekend, we'll take a pause from this course and encourage you to participate in a lesson on the Psalms. When we return together the following week, I would like to zoom into this historical period and rather than give you a historical political commentary, discuss to you the religious impacts and concerns that were going on at this time and taking a good look at the different Jewish sects of the time, what they stood for and why. I hope you benefited from today's summary. We'll see you in 2 weeks.